We talked about the basic filters Photoshop offers. Now let's go into sharpening and liquefying, because although they are filters, I think they're more useful filters that we use more on a regular basis. First, we'll go ahead and talk about liquefying. So again, open up an image and we'll duplicate that image to apply our effects. So Command J, and first we will go into Liquify, which is under Filter, Liquify. Very simply put, the first thing that you want to do is click on Advanced Mode. Without Advanced Mode, you won't see the same thing that I am seeing. And there's some options that may be applicable to you as well. So under Advanced Mode, there are a few things that I always recommend changing. First being that you must know how to change your brush size, which is under the size option here, or you can use the bracket key to change that. Now, pressure is very much like flow. If you keep your pressure very high, it's going to be impossible to liquefy accurately, as you can see. And you can hit Command Z to undo that as well. So I'll keep the pressure really low. Maybe somewhere like 5 or 6 would be good. And the reason for that is most of the stuff that we liquefy seems to be done very gently instead of very abrasively. So, for instance, you can use a big brush, a low pressure, and the density I keep around 50. Density is kind of like softness, where the brush itself seems to be more forgiving than having it at 100 or 0. Playing with that seems to be the best way to get a feel of what's actually happening. So with 50 and 5 or 6 for pressure, I can easily start liquefying and changing different things, like maybe adding volume to her hair, changing the dimensions, and you can really easily modify something or someone really realistically without screwing it up. The second really cool option is the Show Backdrop. When you enable that, where it says use all layers in front, and you move the opacity left and right, you can see where you came from and where you're going. So if you leave it at, say, about 50, and you start tweaking it, you notice right away exactly what's happening. You see the before image in the back, and you see the way it's interacting. So that's a really cool way to see your before and after. Say that you've gone too far. There's an easy way to undo that. There's an undo brush. Right under the first little brush here, which you're on by default, you're going to go to Reconstruct. And similarly, we have a pressure we'll keep really low. And then we'll just brush over the area that we went to. Or if you want to undo everything, just hit Restore All, and it undoes everything. The other neat feature is if you start brushing and liquefying, and you decide that maybe the line itself is really wonky, maybe you did something like this, and you want it a little bit smoother, you can use this brush here. The third brush is called a Smooth tool. And that ultimately smooths out most of the wonkiness of your lines while keeping most of how far you pushed it in. Those are basically the features that I use most of the time when you're brushing or liquefying. Say that you have a lot of images that seem to be in a very similar location. Maybe you're going to be liquefying the exact same thing in the exact same area. You can save a mesh. And then you'd save this somewhere. And then any image you open up again, you just go into Load Mesh, and then load that mesh wherever you saved it. Or you can hit Load Last Mesh, which will load the last image, or load the last liquefy that you did in the previous image. But aside from that, everything else I don't really touch because it's not really necessary when you have such fine control with minimal settings. Aside from liquefying, we're going to go into sharpening. There are a couple of ways to sharpen. I'm going to show you my favorite first and a couple of others as well. My favorite seems to be the high pass filter. Now under filter, other, and high pass, which you're going to do on a copy of an image, or at least a duplicate, you'll see this high pass filter. It's like this gray looking effect that happens. What we're actually trying to look for here is edges. We're trying to see what we want to sharpen. So if we go even lower in our radius, it highlights finer features. So let's say that we want to sharpen just the glasses. So we're going to pick a radius that is more relative to their accessories. So I'll hit OK, because this seems to highlight some of their features without overdoing it. It's not broad. This would be, for example, too broad because you can see halos. And this would be too little because you're not seeing the outline of the glass. So we'll do something like this. We'll hit OK. And we will set this to soft light or overlay. Let's set this soft light. We'll use our mask, Command I, invert it. Now when we brush, and turn it on and off, you see that the glasses get sharpened really nicely in a perfect, I would say the perfect amount. If you want it even more, change it to overlay or hard light and so forth and so on. But for me, I think either soft light or overlay seems to be the right amount of punch that I'm looking for. You can also disable the mask and apply it all over the image if you so choose, because it does a good job of highlighting the contours and the areas of contrast. So that's why I like using this. Keep in mind, there's something really important that I want to show you. Let's say you have a bunch of adjustment layers and you start working with your blank layers and more adjustment layers and so forth, and then you want to sharpen. How would you do that? Well, there's a really cool shortcut, and it's called the Merge Visible shortcut. And what that is Command Option Shift E. You have to be sure before you enter that command, you are on the topmost layer of your layer stack. And you have to be sure that you are not clicked on a mask and that the topmost layer is visible. So click on the topmost layer or the topmost adjustment layer and then hit Command Shift Option E. Or on a PC, Alt Control Shift E. So basically, pretty much all your modifiers and E ends up giving you the merge visible stamp. So again, Command Option Shift E or Control Alt Shift E on a PC. And when you do it right, what happens is you end up with this top layer here. And what is that top layer? It's basically all the adjustments you've done through the whole layer stack. It takes a picture, a stamp of everything you've ever done and puts it on top. So for instance, let's say we have a curve here. We up the curve here and we have a new layer and we take a brush and this is what we like. I don't know why we like it, but let's just say this is what we want to sharpen, right? We can Command Option Shift E. It brings a stamp on top and you'll notice that the thumbnail itself identifies with what we've done so far. So even if we disable all the layers below it, it's still a solid layer of everything we've done. So you can call it like a snapshot. But anyways, once you have the snapshot there, then you're going to go into Liquify, then you're going to go into High Pass to sharpen. Another way that we're going to sharpen is once we make a duplicate, we're going to go to Filter, Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask. Now, Unsharp Mask is something that's been around for a while, and essentially it's something that is supposed to be meant for scans and film scans, but it's also one way to sharpen. And this works very similarly by clicking on the thumbnail view and seeing how intense you want it. This radius indicates a pixel radius. So the higher it goes, the more it applies to a broader region. The lower it goes, the more it applies to a special region. So if you have a higher percentage, there's more impact at the region that you want. And the threshold does something very similar to how the threshold worked with dust and scratches, where it starts taking away the impact in more global regions and leaves them accordingly to finer regions. Personally, I think the best way to understand this, like I said, is to play around with the sliders and see the intensity of what's happening. Next, we're going to go into sharpen and then smart sharpen. Smart sharpen ultimately is something that works even more so than unsharp mask, because if you set it to remove Gaussian blur, technically this is supposed to be the same as unsharp mask. It has the same amount and radius, but they decided to take out the threshold because I guess it wasn't as relevant. And it has different regions for shadows and highlights. So you can decide whether or not you want to have sharpening applied to the highlight regions or shadow regions and so forth. They also have something for lens blur and motion blur. I honestly feel that this seems to give a different effect in terms of sharpening compared to using the Gaussian blur, which is the unsharp mask filter basically. So it's something to play with. I don't think there is one that's absolutely better than the other one, but I feel that using the high pass seems to be much easier to use because you can visually see what's happening and what areas you're going to sharpen and how much it sharpens. This seems to give a little bit of a different effect when you look at it, especially when I crank up the radius. The area changes of how intense the sharpening is. Again, personal preference. I think they all have their own little place. This is supposed to be more applicable for digital images. And if you want somewhere to get started with, I think the radius has to be much higher than the unsharp mask, as well as the amount. So those are the three ways to essentially sharpen. And then you can also play with the shadow and highlight regions and see how much you want your shadows to be sharpened. There we go. So the radius itself had to be high because I actually boosted some of the tonal width on the shadows and highlights. So I told Photoshop to kind of not apply the sharpening across those regions. So now you see when we apply minimal amount in regards to radius, it has quite a bit of a punch to it as well. So start with this and then start seeing how much you want to fade it out. But personally, like I said, I feel the high pass filter does a fantastic job without me needing to play around so much in this area. So there you have it. You know, there are a few ways to sharpen and you can play with some of the rest as well. But ultimately, the high pass seems to be the best one for me. And there's also shake reduction in case you have camera shake going on. It tries to fix that, so forth and so on. You can also turn these into smart objects and make these sharpening filters non-destructible as well. So that concludes our sharpening and liquify filter section. Next, we're going to talk about cropping and saving for different formats.